Thank you. Good morning, church. It's so good to see you and to be with you virtually today. And I'm really pleased that we've been able to keep up some kind of church family connections in this way, albeit online. Very strange for all of us, but what a privilege and pleasure that we can actually connect together still. Many of you will know that I have been off for 3 months on a sabbatical break. Judith as well. We've been taking a break away from church activities for refreshing and renewal and to rest as well. And at the beginning of that time, I went away to a Christian retreat centre down in Devon. And it was a beautiful place. I'd never been there before. I'd only been recommended it. And so I went a little bit nervously, but wanted to make the most of my time there. So I went early, several hours early, before anything started, and booked in and was shown to my room, which would be my little home for the week or so that I was there. And as I arrived in that room, there was a welcome pack which included two maps. An Ordnance Survey map of a larger area and a map just of the retreat centre and its grounds, about 40 or 50 acres, I think, from memory. Now, Judith was going to come down the following week, so we're going to have 2 weeks. I was going to have 2 weeks down in Devon and a week together. So I'd got all my walking gear with me and I'd planned to do some walking if I got the opportunity. So I thought I got a few hours to spare. I'd go for a walk and just enjoy the grounds that were there and do a bit of exploring. Nothing further than that. Didn't bother with my walking trousers, my walking boots, just jeans, obviously a top waterproof jacket and walking shoes would be fine. Little paper map with the hand-drawn one showing the grounds and off I went. Well, I went for a bit of an explore and it didn't take long before I realised that I couldn't quite match up what I was seeing around me with the markings on this hand-drawn map, as good as it was. And if you were to fast forward an hour, you'd find me stood in a field, at that point realising that I no longer quite knew where I was, I no longer knew where I was going, and at this point, as I looked down, I was covered in muck. My nice clean jeans had mud spatters all up them, and that perhaps serves as a useful illustration for life sometimes, that maybe today you're reflecting on where you are and you're thinking, I don't know where I am, I don't know where I'm going, and I'm covered in muck. I actually used that little illustration as a metaphor for some of the things I wanted to work on in a one-to-one session at the retreat centre, and it was there in that first session that I heard a phrase that stuck with me and has resonated and I've been thinking on over these past months. And it was this phrase, that we are held in the gaze of Christ. Held in the gaze of Christ. That meant for me that Jesus sees me wherever I am. He sees me at all times. He sees me in all moments and he cares for me. There's 3 quick stories I want to unpack for us today, and the first is from Genesis 16. It's one of those Bible passages which is really uncomfortable for us, quite awkward, pushes all sorts of buttons socially and in terms of how we have relationships now, but it's in the Bible, and the Bible often includes these raw stories where we read uncomfortably, sometimes through sort of with gritted teeth perhaps, and we're feeling very disconnected and quite concerned about it all, but it's here because God works in messy situations, and God works in the mess and the muck of our lives in a way that we sometimes scarcely want to give credit for. He sees and he cares and he gets involved in our lives. This story is of Abraham and Sarah, 2 prominent Old Testament characters. Abraham has had a promise that he's going to be the father of a great nation and that all nations on the earth will be blessed through him. Sarah, his wife. They're also related, which is slightly awkward and slightly uncomfortable for us. And even more disquieting is the fact that Sarah has a slave called Hagar. Now, God hasn't yet fulfilled his promise to Abraham. Abraham has no children at this point. And Sarah and Abraham are wondering how this is ever going to be fulfilled. Sarah decides to give God a hand, sort of to take God's promise into her own hands, and gives her servant Hagar to Abraham for him to sleep with her, that the promise might be fulfilled through her, instead of through Sarah. Now, we're not told at this point what Hagar thinks about it or if she has any choice. Even though this would have been culturally understood, it's quite a disturbing story for us to read. And it unfolds from there that Hagar, the slave, who falls pregnant and begins to despise Sarah, her mistress. As we read in the Bible text, we see this relationship falling apart, and Sarah at that point then goes to Abraham and complains about her servant Hagar. Now Abraham, as any person would have in this situation, has several choices, and sadly, as many people do, as many of us do from time to time, he chooses the worst of all choices. He says to Sarah, she's your slave, do what you want with her. And so Sarah is hostile to Hagar. She's harsh with her. And Hagar decides she's got no choice but to run away. When we pick up the story in Genesis 16 verse 7, we read this, that the angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. Now it seems likely from what scholars write about this passage that Hagar's heading home. She's heading back to Egypt, running away from Abraham and Sarah, and heading home perhaps to a place of relative safety. She's sitting by a well or by a spring. And it's there by that spring that the angel finds her. She's perhaps exhausted. She may have travelled up to about 50 miles. And the angel finds her the angel of the Lord finds her by this spring. A conversation ensues. Hagar's given an instruction by God in this way, and she's told to go back to her mistress, but also given a promise. And God speaks to her, giving her an incredible promise for her and for her child yet to be born. But that isn't the most remarkable thing. What happens after this is that Hagar makes a comment to God, and in verse 13 it says, she gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. That in itself is a remarkable little story. I can't think of another time in the Old Testament where a person names God. Often people wait to hear the name of God or to see the name of God. God communicates himself with other people, but I can't think of a story where somebody names God. Much less can I think of a story of a woman who's a slave, who's a non-Jewish person, names God. It's a remarkable story. It's a story of someone who's broken, who's got to the end of their options, who's running away, and God appears to them in that moment. And she says, you are the Lord who sees me. The truth is this, that God sees you in whatever situation you find yourself in. However broken you find yourself, however lost you feel, God sees you right now. You're held in the gaze of Christ. In just recent weeks, many of us have seen the horrible images on our TV screens of the brutal killing of George Floyd in America, and the protests that followed, and those events, the killing of George Floyd, have highlighted for millions of people across the world the injustices that still exist in our world today. Millions of other people didn't need those highlighting because they live with them day after day after day. And whichever category of people you fall into, God sees you, and he knows exactly what you're going through day after day after day. He sees you, and you're held in Christ's gaze. God is always concerned for matters of injustice. He's always concerned for those who are outcast. He's always concerned for those who are pushed away to the margins. And here he appears, not to Abraham, not to Sarah, but to Hagar by a spring on a road to Shur as she runs back home. She was seen by God, and so are you and I today, as we're held in the gaze of Christ. God cares for you and for me. The second aspect of this thought of God seeing us and us being held in the gaze of Christ, moves on a little bit. And I want to take us to a New Testament story where Jesus is just about to be put on trial. He's been arrested and taken to the high priest's house, and Peter is watching from the courtyard, and he's observing all this unfolding. He's watching Jesus at a distance. And the story unfolds that Peter is noticed and seen and accused of being one of Jesus' disciples. And in all the chaos that's going on, as Peter must be questioning what's happened, how can the man I followed for 3 years be under arrest, and what's going on? How can all this be happening? He panics and denies Jesus. He denies him 3 times on 3 separate occasions. He says that he's had nothing to do with Jesus. And Jesus has predicted that this would happen. He's told Peter, you'll deny me 3 times before the cockerel crows. And we're told in the Gospels that the cockerel crowed. And in one of the Gospels, it's in Luke, chapter 22, we read this, that at that precise moment as the cockerels crowed, the Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then it says, Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. Before the cockerel crows today, you'll disown me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. We've seen that God saw Hagar on the road, and in this moment, Jesus sees Peter. I don't believe he looks at him with judgment or with condemnation, but he does look straight at him. And Peter, in that moment, knows that Jesus sees him and knows that Jesus knows him. For that's really the second aspect of being seen by God, is that God knows us. We're held in the gaze of Christ, and Jesus doesn't just see us and care for us, but he sees us and knows us. And in that moment when you realise that you're seen by somebody who knows you completely, there's nowhere to hide. There's no need to put up a pretense. There's no need to get the best camera angle. There's no need to give the right image and the right perspective, because somebody knows you deeply and intimately and completely. And Peter in that moment is known and knows that he is. Maybe at times you've felt misunderstood. Maybe you've misunderstood others. You felt judged, or you've judged others. I want to say today that there's one who sees you and knows you completely, in whose presence you cannot pretend or hide. And he looks at you knowingly, with care today. Whilst I've been off, reflecting, reading, praying, walking, doing what everybody else has been doing, trying to find food in the shops and whatever else we've been up to, I've spent some time aware of God's presence in new ways, and in some of those times I didn't particularly feel the need to speak. I found myself sitting aware of God's presence, not needing to say anything, held in Jesus' gaze, knowing that I was known and seen, and that was enough. You know, when someone really, really knows you, you don't need to come up with a story. You don't need to rehash the old stories that you've told everybody else, that you've started to believe yourself. You can just be and rest because you're known. The third very quick story is also a gospel story, and this is in Mark chapter 10 verse 21, and this is where I'm wishing I'd put markers in my Bible, because it would have saved me a moment. That's a lesson for next time, isn't it? Mark chapter 10 verse 21, and this is the story of a rich young man who comes to Jesus. He's tried to follow God through his life, and he's kept the commandments, and he says, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And he and Jesus have a little conversation, and there's a moment in this conversation where Jesus is about to tell him something that he needs to go and do. He's about to give him, a bit like Peter, that moment of knowledge where That young man knows that he's known in a way he hasn't realised before, and all his pretense falls away. But this is the phrase that precedes what Jesus says. It says this in Mark 10 verse 21. Jesus looked at him and loved him. Jesus looked at him and loved him. I believe today that the Bible tells us very clearly, that these three stories tell us very clearly, that Hagar was looked at, cared for, known and loved by God. That Peter was looked at, cared for, known and loved by God. That this rich young man was looked at, cared for, known and loved by God. All three were held in the gaze of Christ. And today you are too. I'm not sure what situation you find yourself in. Whether you today are busy, rushed off your feet, you're exhausted by all that's going on and trying to cope with the environment we're in at the moment, all the different pressures that are on us, and you're just worn out. I want you to know today, and I believe God would have you know today, that you're held in Jesus' gaze, that he sees you, that he cares for you, that he knows you better than you know yourself, and that he loves you. Maybe the opposite's true for you, and you have been isolating and are feeling isolated. You're lacking contact with other people and wondering how long you can cope with what's going on. Well, hear the same words again for you today. That you're held in Jesus' gaze, that he cares for you and knows you and loves you. Whatever your situation, wherever we find ourselves, whether we even find ourselves metaphorically not knowing where we're going, not even knowing where we are, and discovering that we're covered in muck. May we know this day that we're held in Jesus' gaze, that he looks at us lovingly, that he cares, and that he knows. God bless you.